My name is Katie. I'm from Music Guardians. There's just an activity that you might want to think about while we're waiting for all attendees to join over the next couple of minutes. So I'm just really interested to know what you're kind of hoping to gain from this session. So please feel free to utilize the chat with your name, organisation and role responsibility within that role. And then, as I said, what you'd like to gain from this training. You can be as specific as you like. I'm going to talk you through what we'll be covering, but anything specific that you've got, please feel free to write it and I will do my best to address it as we go through the training. So I'm just going to leave that slide on there for the next couple of minutes while we wait for people to arrive. I think just for time, because we've got quite a lot to get through, we'll keep an eye on the chat. So if anyone is still writing anything and wants to share it, we will keep an eye on that as we go, but we're just going to get started. And as I said, it's a very open session. There'll be lots of opportunities for questions, both in the chat and verbally. So hopefully everyone will get an opportunity to ask what they would like. Thank you, Serena. Wonderful. We're going to be talking about some issues around legislation and policy. Okay. Fantastic. So I'm just going to talk you through, sorry, my laptop's going wild. Just going to start off by talking about the access for the session. So we're going to let you know the agenda for the session. There are lots of breaks and opportunities to take breaks. The timing's also going to be on the slide, so you can use that to, get a sense of how long we're going to be spending on each section. I'm going to build description into talking. So by describing myself, and Rachel will do the same, and reading aloud from slides. Closed captions are on. And we're going to ensure that everyone who wants to gets the chance to speak. And then you're going to have these slides. I actually think these slides have been circulated already, but we will also be recording the session and we'll be circulating that recording as well for you. Just a note about the recording is that because we are going to be recording it, we would ask that you don't name any organisations directly. That would be really helpful. Also, just based on the fact that this is likely going to go on the Youth Music YouTube channel. We are going to have a breakout activity at the end, which will be more conversation focused. And due to that, we're going to pause the recording at that point. So at that point, if you want to speak a bit more openly, obviously that won't be recorded. But just wanted to make everyone aware of that. So when it comes to taking care of yourself and others in the meeting, please, if you could display your name and organisation, and then if you're happy to do so, your pronouns as well. When you speak, so if you're asking a question, if you could give your name and organisation each time you speak, that would be really helpful for the whole group so that we know where you're from. Being active and respectful listeners, we're all going to consider different viewpoints, lived experiences and communication needs. If I could ask for your microphone to be muted when you're not speaking. Please feel free to move around, use fidget toys, do whatever you need to do in this meeting setting. Thanks, I can see the majority have cameras on, which is great. We love to see your faces, but obviously if at any point you want to turn your camera off, that is completely fine. There are going to be allocated breaks, but please feel free to take breaks outside of that time as and when you need them. And then if you would like to ask a verbal question, if you could use the raise hand function on Zoom, that would be brilliant. Or if you can't find that, sometimes when I can't find it at short notice, just put your hand up so we can see. That would be amazing. And then we do have a breakout room activity at the end. So I would just encourage everyone to be mindful of letting everyone speak in that setting as they would like to. And then if you're having any technical difficulties, you can just message us direct in the chat and we'll try our best to sort that out for you. So thank you again so much for everyone coming. I'm just going to start off by giving you a visual description of me. So I am Katie. I'm sort of got long brown hair. I've got pale skin. I'm wearing a sort of cream coloured furry cardigan, and I've got a white background behind me. So I'm just going to hand you over to Rachel, who's going to introduce the context of this training. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to see you here today. Thank you for coming. Katie said, my name's Rachel. I've got kind of shoulder length blonde hair. I'm wearing my gold hoop earrings, which always make me feel very fabulous. And you can see I've got the Youth Music logo behind me as I'm working from the office today. And I'm wearing a black cardigan with little flowers on it. I just wanted to start off by giving a little bit of context, really, for why we're running this exchange session today with Music Guardians. So late last year, we published a report called Just the Way It Is, which focused on young people's experiences of harm and harassment and discrimination in the music industries. We did that through research with Music Guardians and also with the Musicians Union. And we spoke to young people with a really wide range of experiences and contexts, doing lots of different roles within different areas of the music industries. And although we're seeing kind of more broadly that harmful music industries cultures are being recognised and being called out, we felt there was that need to bring young people's and young creatives' experiences and voices and perspectives directly into that conversation. And that was really the aim of the report. And one of the things that came out of that was that workplaces that young people were in often created the conditions for harm to occur, whether that was individuals who are directly perpetuating that harmful behaviour, or whether it was due to the informal cultures or a lack of capacity to develop procedures and practices, just to name a few examples. And that young people who were starting out in their career were bearing the brunt of this, particularly as they moved from participants and participating in projects to becoming part of the workforce. And that's a kind of grey area that Katie will talk about more later. But what we also found was that when young people had positive experiences of workplaces, these were really, really powerful, and just how absolutely fundamental it was for them to experience positive practices that really set the standard and model as they go forward into their career what work should be like and what the conditions should be like for them in the music industries. So a key thing we wanted to do coming out of that report was to share learning around these best practices and around how to support young people in professional settings, so that there are more instances for young people to have those positive experiences and take them forward. That's it from me. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Rachel. So as Rachel said, I've been working a lot on these projects, worked on that research project. Just a quick note on Music Guardians. So that's the organisation that I co-founded, and I have a background in education and supporting young people in a creative arts education setting. And Music Guardians was formed essentially as a reaction to the fact that we were hearing so many troubling stories from young people about their experience of moving from sort of sixth form education, sometimes university education, into work specifically in the creative and music industries. And that, ranged from unsafe workplaces and settings, inappropriate introductions on people, a lot of use of social media to, connect artists to producers that might result in harmful and unsafe settings, lots of exploitative kind of no contract, no pay type work, the kind of stuff that we saw maybe 20 years ago, but still sadly does exist a bit. It's better, but it's still not fixed. We wanted to form an organisation that could work both directly with young people and organisations who already either have a provision for young people or want to build one, and just support them in making sure that all of the practices that are put in place are essentially making young people and young adults as safe as possible. So that's from work experience placements to early careers kind of roles, internships, and so on. Have enjoyed so much working with Youth Music. They do such an amazing job. And it's really great that, I'm in a virtual room of people who are so keen to work on this stuff. Because like I always say, I feel like it's a journey, it's a collective journey, and it's a place and a space where we can all kind of learn together. I always get really inspired when I hear the amazing things that people are already doing. So that's always brilliant. And then today's just going to be about going through some things that hopefully will add some benefit to your organisations, the things that you're either doing or plan to do. And as I say, it's a really open space for questions. And I'll try my absolute best to offer advice and give you answers to things that you have. And, there may be things that I don't have the answers to, but hopefully we'll be able to talk it all through together. So just a note on questions. There's going to be, as I said at the beginning, opportunities for questions at the end of the 3 sections. If you've got questions that come up and you don't want to forget them as you're going, please feel free to write them in the chat, but I will address them at the end of each section, if that's okay, just to make sure that we cover everything that we need to. But yeah, please write them as we go, because I know that's something that I would need to do, because otherwise I might forget them. Okay, so we're going to start with our first section, which is kind of context and strategies. So this section is going to be about half an hour, then there'll be an opportunity for questions and a break. So obviously the title of this training is No More Grey Areas, and we're thinking specifically about how we can support young people. So I just wanted to start with the context of this grey area that we speak about quite a lot, that unfortunately does exist quite noticeably in the creative industries and the music industries. So when we're talking about that, we're essentially talking about young adults who fall between that age of 18 and 25. Now, obviously, we know that there are lots of legislation measures in place that would protect under 18s, whether it's a work setting, in their educational setting, in work experience placements that they might be doing, any of those kind of intersections between the creative industries and under 18s that are involving themselves in that. However, because obviously legally those young people become adults when they're 18, they just don't get that same access to the support that under 18s do. But as we all know, there's very little difference between being a 17-year-old and being an 18-year-old, even a 19-year-old, 20-year-old. We all will remember what it was like to be in those early career stages, particularly when we think about, the beast that is the music industry. Can be very, very daunting. I work specifically with this age group, and having worked in secondary schools and also a lot between the ages of 16 and 19, and then also with, 18 to 25-year-olds, I can, as I'm sure all of you can, say firsthand that there is very little difference. So what tends to happen is young people that have been in supportive environments in, let's say, their sixth forms, their colleges, also sometimes university, I suppose they experience lots of support, feeling very protected, almost in like a bit of a safety bubble. And then they leave that setting, they're out trying to find their way in the music industry. And not only is that very daunting and quite difficult and, representing lots of different risks to them, there is the added factor of the fact that they don't have a lot of that same protection that they would if they were under 18. So what I suppose I wanted to frame this kind of training today around was the idea of taking more of a kind of moral and ethical approach when you're thinking about how you can support young people in your workplace, your organizations, or any collaborations and partnerships that you do with young people. And I suppose just think about the fact that even though legally you might not have to consider something based on the fact that this young person is 18, 19, has already left their educational setting, actually think about, what could you still do, which maybe is not necessarily a legal requirement, but would make the world of difference to a young people who's in that early career stage, who, is very inexperienced and who is in your organization. And when I say in your organization, I mean in some capacity, because I understand lots of you, I'm sure, will have kind of collaborative work that you might do with young people, but doesn't necessarily mean that they are in your organization full time. But, and that's really the approach that Music Guardians has always taken. And, in all of the work that I've done with young people, I find that that is something that has had probably the biggest effect. Because it can be daunting if you turn 18, it's like, great, I'm on my own now. We want basically young people to feel like they're not on their own when they reach that age group. So that's what we talk about. Now, there are other grey areas that exist as well when we get into some of the detail or some of the legalities. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that when we talk specifically around internships and pay, because there is another kind of grey area that exists there, but we'll get to that in a few slides' time. So when we think about the main issues affecting young adults in the music industry, and I'm sure many of you have probably either witnessed this or experienced this. So the first one is just the lack of access to the music industry. The music industry is still an industry that is very much desired in terms of young people wanting to get into that. It's as popular as ever, I would say. And although access to the music industry, I would say, has improved, I'm sure we've all seen evidence of the fact that, you know, we still have poor practices that exist when it comes to accessibility, mainly, you know, getting that foot in the door, you know, the old kind of it's not what you know, it's who you know. And unfortunately, you know, when we think back to 20 years ago when there were so many, you know, unpaid, full-time, long-term, unpaid work placements that would be accessible only to young people who potentially like already had a contact, were from, you know, a kind of more privileged financial background, you know, young people who are able to live at home and not contribute to their household. You know, we are all aware of how exploitative all of those types of things are, and just how it completely excludes huge groups of young people, young adults who want to break into this industry. Unfortunately, that is still a really big issue. Pay is also still massive. Again, not as big as it used to be, but low and no pay for various reasons is still something that is very, very prevalent. I still get lots of people getting in contact with me offering like what is framed as an opportunity for a young person or a young adult, but actually it is quite exploitative. People are very kind of keen, I would say, to sort of utilize words like volunteer, work placement, shadowing, when actually a lot of the time the work being completed actually would deem that young person, young adult, to be a worker, and they should be being paid. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that is still something that's very visible. And as I say, I'm sure lots of you have seen that. Unsafe work settings. A lot of these unsafe work settings, I would say, are less formal than a young person working in an established organization. Often these unsafe work settings can come from like collaborative work. I mentioned at the beginning that social media is still a big tool that people are using. And whilst obviously we can all recognize the benefits of social media for, let's say, young people and young adults promoting their work within the music industry, when it's used as kind of a communication tool, and this is particularly problematic when we're talking about under 18s, which some of you may, you may be working with some people who fall into that category in your different organizations. That's obviously not the safest way for people who want to collaborate, especially if they are adults speaking to under 18s using social media. So we can have, that when I say unsafe work settings, I mean that in kind of a broad term. Also, lack of contracts or exploitative contracts. I think a big issue, and this is amongst that whole age group, because, to go back to my point about still feeling very young, even if you are legally an adult, it's not necessarily just that there's a lack of contract or an exploitative contract. I think the issue as well is around young people and young adults not necessarily understanding the language that are used in the contracts, and therefore getting themselves signed into something which is not beneficial to them and can be quite harmful. That's something that I've seen quite a lot. So that's still a big issue. And then I think lack of support available in work settings, or lack of resource available in smaller organizations. Now, this is not anything which is perhaps done deliberately. I think sometimes it is just reality and an inevitability of a smaller organization who maybe is trying their best, really wanting to do everything that they can to support these like young adults that are coming in their early career stages to collaborate or to work with you. But sometimes, if you are a tiny organization and you are stretched, it can be difficult. So we're also going to spend a bit of time thinking about things that we can do in small organizations that don't use too much resource, and especially don't use like financial resource, because I know that sometimes can be the challenge when, we want to do the best possible for early careers kind of workers and so on, but we don't have that. We don't have that resource. And then also I think lack of knowledge in young people of where they can seek external support. And that's often exacerbated by lack of experience and also I'd say lack of confidence in early careers worker. Again, I think, you might meet someone who is 22 or 23, and sometimes just based on a number of factors, they might come across as very confident, and maybe they are very confident, and they're very mature and they seem to be very comfortable in these settings. But also you can meet 23-year-olds who are completely the other end of the spectrum of that, and they need a lot more support. So I think just making sure that you are kind of always communicating with young people as much as possible, and young adults as much as possible is really important. But we're going to talk about that when we get to some of the strategies. So I'm just going to have a quick reflection point. So I'd just like you to take a moment to think about, in your organization, what are you already and currently doing well to support young adults and early career workers? Now, if you're from an organization and you don't maybe yet have any work that you do with young adults and early career workers, but you plan to or you want to, the second question might be more relevant, which is what is something that you haven't actioned yet that you would like to do in the future? So yeah, if it's something that's going to happen for you or you'd like to put it in place, then maybe just think about question 2. If you are comfortable to share in the chat, that would be brilliant. But if you just want to take it as a moment and reflect yourself, that's also fine. I'm just going to leave this slide on for a couple of minutes to give you the opportunity to think about that. Oh, it's great to see lots of good things are already happening, so that's brilliant. Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, that's great. This is so nice to see some of the really great things that you're doing to really show that you are thinking about young adults. You know, I can see some points about kind of consulting on the way that they like to communicate, which is super important. And I can see some of you are doing some really good work on like personalizing approaches, which is, you know, yeah, absolutely at the heart of making sure that young adults feel like safe and included and able to, you know, complete their work to the best of their ability. So yeah, that's really great to see. Thanks so much, everyone, for sharing those things. Okay, so we're just going to sort of continue on from there to think about some strategies that we could use. And yeah, it looks like so many of you are doing great things anyway. But we'll just talk through some of these things that might be useful to you. So proactivity over reactivity. If you've been as proactive as you can and you've prepared as much as you can in advance, that really does kind of mitigate as many of those risks as possible. And even if something does still occur, if you've been proactive, in your risk assessment, you've thought about as many possible scenarios that might occur in that setting, at least then you're never going to be, well, obviously anything can happen, but you're far less likely to be in a situation where something completely unexpected and out of the blue has happened if you've kind of considered it beforehand and you've really done your due diligence with like your paperwork and your consultation. This kind of proactivity over reactivity, generally that's sort of the approach really that I take with any work with young adults and young people under 18s in that grey area of 18 to 25. And it has been, you know, just really, yeah, just a really positive outcome on all of the different settings and work that I've done with young people and people in that grey area. After proactivity over reactivity, and this will be relevant to some of you here and less relevant to those of you who maybe aren't taking on young adults in internships, but within your organizations, training all staff on current legislation around pay for internships is really, really important. Just because I think with smaller organizations, with less formal kind of collaboration and partnerships, often, you know, even with young adults working with other young adults, you know, we've spoken about this internally with youth music around like funded young people and how they work with each other. Like the culture of making sure that people are paid is really important, as we all know, especially in the current situation that we are facing in this country as well. So making sure that everybody really understands that, because a lot of people don't know that actually it's not legal to do an unpaid internship. Now, I just wanted to talk briefly about this kind of second grey area that I wanted to mention. So there is a grey area around this because the actual term intern and internship doesn't actually have any legal protection, even though there is a law against somebody doing an unpaid internship if they are actually a worker. Now, that can be a bit confusing because obviously we use the term intern all the time, but essentially it's a little bit, I would say, it's not that it's unregulated. I guess there's just not enough attention on it. So it is something that could be reported. So let's say, for example, you are a young adult, you're working in a role where very clearly it would be classified legally as a worker, in that you are adding value. You are expected to be in certain hours. You have set working hours and so on, and you are actually completing work. It might be labelled by an organisation that as an internship, but if the reality of what is taking place is that that person is a worker, legally they would be deemed as a worker, and the term worker is like legally protected, and the national minimum wage should be paid in that instance. Now, although that exists, if you are a young, early career adult, and maybe you are presented with something that is an organization or a company that you really, really want the experience of working in, and you are presented with something that is labeled as an internship, it's very unlikely that those young adults are going to feel confident to actually report, because they in theory they could report to HMRC and they could say, I'm completing this work, and they actually are entitled to apply for back pay if there's evidence that what they've been doing is work. However, from all of my experience of working with young people, I've never seen any young adult or young person who'd been in that situation actually know that information is there and know that they can make that report. What I have seen is young adults and young people seeking support, let's say with youth music or music guardians, to say, oh, I'm in this situation. But the fact that, that is the situation around internships and unpaid internships, and there is this kind of lack of knowledge, and again this sort of second grey area that exists here. I think it's really important that everybody knows that. Now, obviously what that does mean is that organizations can still take on volunteers, and they are, they could in theory have a full-time volunteer who is working 5 days a week, and even though if they are legally a volunteer, they can't actually sort of demand that they're in. But, I've seen situations, unfortunately, where organizations do take on volunteers and there is an expectation that they're in. And, if they kind of, don't show up, then that opportunity is going to be taken away from them. So unfortunately, there is some bad practice that still exists around people like utilizing different language, in order to essentially gain what they're hoping for, which is a young adult often working for free, in a situation that, yes, may have benefits to them in terms of the experience that they're going to gain. However, that kind of needs to be irrelevant now, like in the world that we live in now, when we think about, again, cost of living crisis, not wanting to be exploitative, just in terms of, making everything fair and equitable. We should be really pushing, all of us, for not having any of this kind of unpaid work. Now, obviously there are, as I'm sure many of you will know, there are exceptions. So when someone is just shadowing and it's maybe just a couple of days, or where, let's say a young person or a young adult is doing a work placement that is part of their educational program. So, if you're a sixth form or a university, and as part of a music course that you're doing, it's been organised that you're going to spend 2 weeks kind of shadowing and observing in a work placement, obviously like that is not something that would come under this category. But we're talking about those sort of longer term placements that really, when we all look at it objectively, we can see that this young person or young adult is completing work and they're adding value, and it's labelled as an internship, but it's not being paid. Like that is, that's not legal. Now, there's a really great section on the government website, which actually, thinking about it now, I should have made this linkable, but when we circulate the recording afterwards, I can add that so that you've got it, that really clarifies that in detail. Because it's a lot of, there's a lot of different terms and there are a lot of different kind of specific situations. But I think the main thing that we all want to, of course, be moving towards, and I know everybody will be sharing the same view, I'm sure, in this training, which is why we're here, is that we want to be paying young people, young adults, people in those early career settings. So making sure that everybody is kind of on that same page and really has that knowledge around pay is really important. But as I say, I'll make sure that link, so that you can have a look at that in your own time, can be circulated with the recording of the slides as well. Hopefully that will be useful for those of you who don't know about that anyway. Also, providing support systems for all young people and early career workers, like even if they are over 18, is really important. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm very aware, as we will all be aware, that the smaller the organisation, often the more stretched you are resource-wise. So when we are trying to think outside of, let's say, financial resources and thinking, what could we put into place within organisations that, is more of a time resource rather than a financial resource. So think about like buddy mentor systems, think about things like weekly support sessions, even if they're just half an hour, or like a period of time in the week, it's like a drop-in session. Often, to go back to that kind of proactivity over reactivity point, often sort of like catching something in the bud when it's still small and giving a young adult or an early career worker the opportunity to speak about something that might be bothering them early on is inevitably going to stop it building up and becoming a bigger issue, which might then turn into a safeguarding issue, which is then for everyone going to be more challenging and not something that we really want to have. So just within the different structures and the different sizes of your organizations, think about what might be realistic, because that's the other thing. You want to make sure that it is realistic and it doesn't then become something that is not going to be sustainable. So, and that will be personal to all of your organizations. But if you can get something like that in, I think it's really important. And the thing I always sort of say to myself is I just dial back and I remind myself how it felt when I was kind of early career. And really when you put yourself in that position, it's, quite daunting. So any opportunity to be able to check in, have a chat, have a bit of support in that way, I think is going to be hugely beneficial to any organization. I know many of you mentioned that you are making your policies like really livable. That is amazing. I think policies can often be sort of, I say dusty old documents, they're obviously not physical anymore really, but as in documents that exist that maybe aren't really livable, are a little bit, even to people who are more experienced in their career, not that easy to kind of like digest and break down. That's going to obviously make them even more inaccessible to early career workers who haven't really experienced policies before and maybe don't really fully even like understand like kind of what they are meant to do. So I think as much as you can, making them inclusive, accessible, consider, displaying or making them visual in the workplace. If you are like a remote online kind of workplace, just thinking where can it be, maybe on your website, easily accessible. And also I think as part of like any induction, and that's goes for someone starting in a full-time role to just maybe some collaboration you might be doing for a couple of weeks, like use that as part of the induction so that early career workers and young adults and young people, really know how to use them. It's often useful as well to, again, depending on the context of like how many young adults or early career people that you're working with, to do almost like a micro version of the most important thing. So, I've seen some really good practice in workplaces, where they have like visual displays of like a 1-page version of, let's say, the safeguarding policy, reporting mechanisms and things like that. Because sometimes policies can get very long, and, just to pull out the most important points of that are going to be most useful to those people in that group can be helpful. Providing contracts, would always encourage providing contracts, even with short-term work or one-off work, even if it's just a day's work. If maybe you are providing an opportunity for a young adult to work on an event that you're organizing. I just think, again, a general kind of rule and guidance that I always sort of like live by with this type of work is just transparency, and keeping everything as transparent as possible. Young adults, and I think particularly in the that current generation, I think it's something that they all really crave and want. It's maybe not something, when I think back to my kind of early career point of work, maybe didn't really exist, but I think now it's like more important than ever. And I just think it's going to avoid issues in the long term. And it makes everything easier to manage if something does arise, if that transparency has been there since the beginning. And I think providing contracts is super important for that. And it's just really good practice to get into. Because again, I know that like, I've seen lots of examples of what seems to be a bit more informal work taking place without contracts, and then inevitably that like offers up again lots of potential kind of grey areas, unknowns, things that haven't really been spoken about in advance, but then, form an issue. And then that just makes it much more challenging to deal with. And often the person who comes off worse is going to be the less experienced early career young person, young adult, and so on. And then, I've kind of touched on this already, but just to go back onto it, that communication that I mentioned when I was thinking about, either a buddy mentor system or a weekly support session is so important. Like regular consultation with people in that like working stage is just really important. It becomes collaborative. It will naturally, I would say, would make them feel more invested in the work that they're doing, and therefore be beneficial for everyone. Giving them a bit of agency, and just feeling like they matter, and that organizations care about what it is that they need, and so on. I think can just again create a really great sort of workplace culture that is going to be beneficial to everyone. So, And as I say, I can see some amazing things that are going on from what you have put in the chat anyway, which is great. So hopefully these might add a few more kind of add-ons or ideas to things that you are doing existingly, giving that a word. So we're going to have a break in just over 5 minutes. So I just wanted to take a moment to ask if anyone has got any questions. Obviously, please feel free to unmute yourself or put your hand up, or you can use the chat function. I'll just have a look and see if I've missed any in the chat now. Oh, I can see some people have written some things.
So essentially, we half of our board is under the age of 30, and most of them are former participants who do still go on to do occasional work with us as young producers. And essentially at the moment, I'm making a judgment call on what I feel goes beyond trusteeship. But I wondered if if there's any clarity around that in making that decision.
That's actually, I'm sorry to say so, that's not actually something that I have experienced.
No problem.
In my work yet, but that is a really good and valid question. I mean, because I'm sure that structure might be something that exists in some other organizations as well. So I think that is, I'm unfortunately not anything that I have knowledge on now, but I absolutely can prioritize having into that. When you say a judgment call, as in, do you mean like, so they've been trustees, then they're doing the work, and whether they can still remain trustees? Is that what you mean? Or
no, it's basically, so for example, let's see, we've got a trustee at the moment who's going to be part of a training collective we have that we are developing youth voice training with.
Amazing.
And they're coming in at the end of the process to be one of the people who basically sits in on a test run of the training and then gives feedback. And from their point of view, will say if they feel anything is missing in terms of the training. And because that will probably be a full day's work, I'm going to be paying them for that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that makes more sense. I mean, I know that you can't be like on the payroll essentially if you are a trustee. But again, like what I don't know, and I think this is probably the question that you're looking for clarification on, if it is just like a day or it's just short-term work rather than like longer term or longer term contracted work, whether that is still something that is able to take place. If it is just a day's work, that's something that I would have to do a bit more digging into, Sarah. But I know in terms of long term, they wouldn't be able to sit in both of those roles just purely because of the issue of the payment. Because I know because I've had that experience myself actually with the work that I do. So I do some consultancy work with a charity, and I felt like one of the obvious people that would be a trustee, but legally it's not something that can be done just based on the fact that I do, I'm basically essentially on a retainer as a consultant for, for that same company. So, but there might be more specific rules, I guess, and guidance around just if it is just one off. I mean, is it normally just in individual days like that, or do you have any situations where those trustees you're talking about maybe go on to do longer?
We have a couple of delivery partners that are on our board as well, and we have them declare that at the start of each meeting. And then we have a section in our annual report that, is displayed publicly, that is transparent about what work they have done and the amount that they have been paid for it.
Yeah.
There's a belief that is legally required.
Yeah.
So we've taken that approach to date with any of our young producers, but maybe it's something I need to talk to the Charities Commission about directly.
Yeah, I know that we got quite a lot of help from the accountant who, just in the context I was mentioning, the accountant who was helping us, helped us get our charity status and that. So I think either one of those would probably have charity. But I do know that if it's like long-term ongoing work, being a trustee is not something that is able to be. But yeah, as I say, for those just smaller parts, sorry, I couldn't give you
don't worry
information on that. But yeah, that's a really good one.
I think it highlights its grey area.
Yeah, there are so many. It's challenging, but yeah, okay, great. That's given me some homework. Thanks, Sarah.
Just to say, Katie, I've just popped in the chat, and I'm sure you've seen already, Sarah, the Charity Commission guidance on the different instances when you can pay trustees and what you need to have in place in order to do those different forms of payment. And it includes the definition of what a goods or a service is. So if you're paying a trustee for an unrelated service or goods that aren't related to their trusteeship. But obviously that's a kind of broad definition rather than a specific kind of case by case of what that counts as in your organisation. But it also distinguishes between that and paying them for their duty as a trustee and kind of what that line would be in broad terms.
Thank you. I'll look through that.
Thanks, Rachel. Vic, thanks for sharing that. And there, I've just, I see that happening quite a lot as well, that you've seen a high profile music advertising a 30-hour-week internship. Again, it's really interesting to see how many organizations don't actually know, the legalities around this. But I think because of that thing that I outlined about the fact that the term intern actually doesn't have any legal protection, but the word worker does. So that is frustrating, because what it sort of does is it puts the onus on the people having that experience to be like, wait, hang on a minute, I can see this, in the government guidance, and I have to do something about it, which is not how it should be. So, I know that we asked at the beginning to not name organizations, but I'm going to do a bit of digging after to see if I can find it, because one of the things that in my work that I really find is important is, in a supportive and an open way, to make it a discourse, but speak to people directly and say, this is not actually legal, nor is it ethical to be presenting this. Because, as frustrating as it is, I think a lot of people just don't think through it fully. And, we're just thinking about the exploitative nature of it. But once you get into the accessibility of it, it just shows a real lack of understanding of so many things, class system in this country, they don't understand the fact that in advertising positions like that, especially as well, with so many companies, actively putting a diversity push on their recruitment, and then really showing such a lack of understanding of how inaccessible they are making this, by offering something like what you've described, Vic, to a lot of the people that they would like, that they are saying that they would like to hire. So it's a bit of a mess, but yeah, I think unfortunately there's a lot of lack of knowledge, but it's really, really important. I think collectively, any opportunity that we have to speak directly to people that are advertising things like this, and let them know that actually they are advertising something that does sit outside the legalities. And even though it's not completely apparent everywhere and obvious to everyone, all you need to do is a little bit of digging, and then it's very easy to see that. But it's really frustrating when you see that kind of thing. But thank you for sharing that, because I'm going to go and do some detective work afterwards. See, because I think it's important, just to talk to people about that. And also as well, the fact that it's a high profile kind of music organization, that's also frustrating, because they probably have the ability to build something that is more accessible. And even if it's not 30, maybe they, haven't got the resource to take someone on for 30 hours a week, but then what they should be doing is looking at the work that they need doing and what they can, feasibly afford in terms of taking someone on and doing that. So yeah, I could talk about that all day, but let's stop. So Sarah, thank you. I've just seen, oh great, a one pager, that's great. I can, again, loads of examples of really great stuff that you're all doing. So thank you so much. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. So we're going to just take a kind of 5-minute comfort break now. So we'll come back. It's 10:58. So yeah, if we just come back for about kind of just before 5 past, and then we'll move on to the next section. Okay, we'll just start back in. Oh, I think, is everyone back in? Yes, great. Excellent. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say, Paul, sorry, I missed your question about teenage inhibition. If it's okay, when we have the opportunity for questions at the end, that's something we can speak about. I wouldn't say it's anything that I'm kind of an expert on, but obviously I have worked with young people and young musicians for a long time. So I can see that you've also been given another suggestion, but yeah, I'll come back to that if it's okay in the next question section. Okay, so in this section, we're going to look at kind of like best practice for employers. And when I use the term employers, again, I'm thinking kind of a bit more broadly than that, because I know that it's not always a case of young adults and people that you're working with being employed. It might be some collaborative work, some short-term work, but yeah, just in terms of things that you can do when working with young adults that can be beneficial for everyone. So it's kind of a combination of a couple of updates. We're going to start by looking at some changes that took place at the end of last year around like NDA laws, which could be useful for you all to know. And then we're going to think a bit about safer recruitment, and I'll go into a bit more detail around risk assessments that I touched on briefly, and working with external partners, which hopefully will help with some of those questions that came up earlier. So many of you will have seen already at the end of last year some of the changes to NDA laws, which are really, really beneficial for people who've experienced some of the more like harmful behaviors when it comes to the music industry, because as you know, as we will know already, like historic use of NDAs in the music industries have often been quite harmful, and they've often been used to cover up bad practice. And there has been a lot of kind of people quite vocally speaking about and kind of campaigning for a change in the way that NDAs are used, so that they are basically not used for those negative reasons and ways, which is thankfully what we've seen in some of the reforms. Now, there are still some things that are kind of like in conversation that haven't been put into place yet, but the reforms that were put into place at the end of last year, which are the most relevant to kind of us as a collective, is that NDAs that purport to stop employees from reporting harassment or discrimination will now be unenforceable, which is really important because, yeah, historically there were many cases of NDAs being used for that reason, which is obviously very harmful, especially to people if they're in their like early career stages. NDAs that have been used previously to use the term silence workers who have experienced, let's say, sexual harassment, bullying, discriminatory treatment will no longer be legally valid if they seek to block those particular disclosures, which is a really, really great step in the right direction. And also under the Victims and Prisoners Act of 2024, victims who sign NDAs can still speak about criminal conduct, which often includes harassment or abuse, which again, sometimes might be deemed to be in kind of like a grey area, but, actually looking objectively is criminal conduct that can now be spoken about without breaching the NDA, whereas previously, that still would have been classed as breaching the NDA. And I think as well, there was has been historically a lot of kind of like fear mongering around that. And again, the earlier career you are, the younger you are, if you've been kind of, your hand's been sort of forced into sign an NDA, you do feel very like trapped, and you feel very like powerless, often when you've already experienced something very unpleasant. So these reforms are just really kind of like useful to know about. And from my experience, I have worked with young adults who have had really unpleasant situations like this, and when I think about these reforms, that is a really great step in the right direction, particularly for the music industry, as I say, which unfortunately has historically used NDAs in, bad practice, I would say. I just wanted to kind of give an update about that, which is, great moving forward in the direction that we want for, supporting people in the music industry. Then I just wanted to move on to think about safer recruitment. So as organisations, there are so many commitments that we can make when it comes to safer recruitment in order to support and protect young adults working within your organisation. And again, we're thinking about this quite broadly. That's in terms of the people in the organisation that the young adults are going to be coming in and working with, and also just generally the culture that you create in terms of transparency, good practice, good employment practice, and so on. So obviously references, ID checks, really, really important. But the third bullet point I just wanted to take a moment to talk about, which I think is maybe sometimes maybe not given as much importance placed on it as should do, which is just incorporating safety and rights into interviews and also job descriptions. I think that's not necessarily always something that we see, but the more we can move to a place where we do see that is really important in terms of, I guess, setting the tone and showing where you stand as an organisation on prioritising safety and rights, prioritising safeguarding. And I think, if people are seeing that from the point of even just looking at opportunities that exist within your organisations, again, whether that's a job, a work placement, a short-term kind of contract, I think that just sends a really, really good message, again, collectively, that we're all moving in the same direction. We're all prioritising the same things. And I also think, the knock-on effect of that will be that you will get not better candidates, that's the wrong word, but you will just get people will feel more comfortable in wanting to come and work with you and within your organizations and collaborate with you, because they will see that you prioritize those things which are so important to everyone now, again, particularly at those early career stages of work. We also can think about DBS checks. Now, DBS checks, they are complex in terms of how they can be used, when they're required, and so on. And we have put as a link on this slide, which you'll get. Oh no, you've already had these slides, so you can have a look at that. But there's very thorough DBS eligibility guidance on the government website, which would probably be of interest to you. So obviously they are required in some contexts if working with under 18s, and they're often not required for work with over 18s, but there are some exceptions to this. So if, for example, somebody is classed as a vulnerable adult, or looking at the contextual safeguarding of a particular situation, it might be appropriate to think about DBS checking in that setting. But the best thing to do, again, is to really familiarise yourself with that DBS eligibility guidance, because there is a lot of nuance to kind of different roles, different settings, and different age groups as to whether or not, they're going to be appropriate for your setting. But just, they can be, and they often can be useful. So that's just something to draw your attention to. I can see from the chat, some people have mentioned that they're already doing that. So again, just working out kind of as and when you think that's appropriate. And again, I will go back to that point I made around personalization. The more personalized approach you take to each situation and each person, that will kind of enable you to kind of make the right decision when it comes to safeguarding and DBS. And then again, just a note, sometimes it might be worth considering the update service, but again, that's very dependent on the role, the length of time that somebody might be working with you, what kind of activity they're going to be taking part in, and so on. So I just wanted to kind of raise that as a point, but also make a note of the kind of complexities of it, which is why we've put that link there. But it might be something that is useful depending on the activity and the person. Now, moving on to risk assessments. Risk assessments, you probably will kind of get from the amount I've been talking about them, but they are, I just think, the most important thing that you can be doing if you want to support a proactive and safe working environment. And again, risk assessments can, in the past, maybe, again, you hear the term risk assessments and some people might think, okay, this is just like a mandatory thing that we have to do. And they might have a template that they just kind of copy and paste and change like the key things. Obviously, a risk assessment like that is not going to be particularly useful because that's not real and that's not living, that's not personalized, that's not proactive. But when you use risk assessments well, they can honestly be the difference in a big safeguarding incident and then something which is, very minor that can be sorted out very quickly. So I've just put on bullet points there, kind of the key words that I always have in my head when I'm completing my risk assessment. So they should be regular, they should be thorough, they should be timely. Really importantly, they should be bespoke, they should be inclusive, and they should always consider contextual safeguarding. I'm sure everyone in this group is probably familiar with the term contextual safeguarding, but just in case anyone wants kind of like a recap, contextual safeguarding essentially is like a branch of safeguarding that really considers all of the sort of unseen factors, the additional factors, the things which are going to be affecting somebody outside of like just the immediate environment. So I'll just use the example from earlier about the young people performing in the pub. So when you're doing a risk assessment, you're considering safeguarding. You're obviously going to be thinking about the venue. You're going to be thinking about the fact that there's alcohol there. You're going to be thinking about the fact that it's a late night event. You're going to be thinking about the area where it is. And, we heard the story about the altercation taking place outside. Is that in an area where that type of thing takes place regularly? You've got all of those things that you're going to consider for your regular safeguarding, but contextual safeguarding really thinks about kind of the individual and the circumstances and situations that are, let's say, affecting them outside of all those things which we are like really aware of and obviously aware of. So for example, let's say that 16-year-old who is performing in the band has got all of those risks that I've just mentioned that we need to consider, but then also let's say they are also a carer at home and they have got significant responsibilities that, mean that that's going to take an impact on them. That is something that would be a contextual safeguarding issue that would need to be built into your risk assessment. Maybe even it's something smaller and it's just that they live like a very far distance away from the place that they're getting to and thinking about how that's going to impact their travel. It could be about the additional needs that they have. It could be an accessibility issue. It could be that they have a disability. There's a number of, things that it could be, but really taking that personalized approach and making sure that you are thinking about the contextual safeguarding when you're doing your risk assessments is going to make a huge amount of difference. Now, obviously, of course, this means that your risk assessments are going to take longer, but they are going to be better. They're going to be more living and they're going to be more usable, and they are going to inevitably do a much better job at ensuring that even if something does take place that becomes, let's say, a safeguarding issue or a safety issue, you're going to sort of already have thought about like what your plan would be if that thing took place in order to kind of like mitigate those risks. So yeah, I can't stress enough like how important, and I know that you will all be doing risk assessments anyway. I just think I always see, like when I'm creating my risk assessments for whatever situation I'm creating it for, I kind of always see it as a challenge to myself to see how much like more regular, thorough, timely, bespoke, inclusive, and so on I can make them, because, I've seen really bad risk assessments and I've seen really incredible risk assessments, and they do like make all the difference, because it's not actually about the document. Of course, we know it's not about the document. It's about the process that you go through in order to create that. And it's like all of that time you allow yourself to really be proactive and think about all the things that might take place. And then the document is just, that's just the result of that. Obviously, you need to have that, but it's the process that's the most important bit for that. So I can't stress that enough. But as I say, everyone in this group seems to be doing amazing things. So I'm sure you already have great practice when it comes to your risk assessment. Also just like if in doubt, just always create one. If you're like, I'm not 100% sure if we need one here, it's always better to err on the side of caution and do one anyway. Because again, back to what I just said, that process of thinking everything through will just prepare you so much better for anything that might occur. Okay, and then just thinking about external partners. So I touched on this briefly earlier. So obviously we have our organizations, but then we always have people that we collaborate with, that we take on as contractors, people who might be coming to do some short-term work. And I'm talking about people outside of the young adult kind of community that you might have working in those same shorter-term contracts. So we're talking about like regular people that partner with you. It's really, really important to make sure that those external partners should be subject to those same kind of rigorous checks that you would do with your own staff internally to ensure that their values align with those of your organisation. Because I think, I'm sure there are people in this group who may have had this experience of where you might work with somebody, partner on a project, or somebody might come in to do some short-term work, and then it only really reveals itself when the work is taking place that actually there might be some issues in terms of values aligning or approaches to certain things. Again, thinking retrospectively, it's you can think back and consider what you might have been able to do prior to agreeing to that partnership or taking somebody on as a contractor to make sure that your values are aligned. So that's something that is really, really important, and definitely something that kind of like I've learned in my career as well, because I've found myself in situations in the past where I've been working with somebody on a project or maybe a mentor program where I've taken somebody on to mentor a young person, and they've done the training and the induction, but it only reveals itself throughout the meetings that actually maybe this person isn't completely aligned with the values of the organization that the mentors are being provided from. So it's super important to do that, because even though they're not necessarily part of your organization in terms of they might not be an employee or a regular member, they are still part of your organization's kind of family, and like reputationally, obviously nobody wants to find themselves in a situation where they've partnered with maybe an individual or an organization that is potentially kind of problematic in the nature of what you do. So really good way to make sure that you are doing that is to sort of align with them, to set expectations, to complete training with all of your partner organizations, kind of primarily on how your organization works, how you work with kind of young adults and young people, how you support them, and just ensure that is done prior to like any contracting, any partnering. Again, to go back to that culture of transparency, have that same culture of transparency with anyone who is going to come and work with or represent your organization, because again, that's not going to completely safeguard the fact that still something might reveal itself that might go against the, let's say, the like morals or the expectations or values of your organization. But if you have that culture of transparency and you have gone through this process beforehand, it'll be, again, much easier to kind of nip in the bud and sort out than if it hadn't been spoken about and you just discover it kind of as you're going and then don't know how to deal with it. And then again, going back to risk assessment. So another thing that you can do is to risk assess frequently when working with young adults. So particularly around these partner organizations or partners, consultants, whatever is relevant to your individual organizations in terms of how you partner with external people. But yeah, as always, preventative measurements are key. So before we have some questions, we're just going to have another reflection point on recruitment practices. So I'd just like you to think about how your organization currently utilizes risk assessments or potentially DBS checks, or how you intend to use them in the future, if you intend to use them in the future. And then, have there been any situations in your organization when a risk assessment may have prevented an issue that occurred? And that could be with an external partner, or it could just be within the organization. And obviously only share what you're comfortable to share. If you prefer to just, keep it to yourself and just take these few moments to reflect, that's fine. But it would be great if anyone does feel comfortable to share any thoughts that they have on this. So I'm just going to give you a few moments to have a think about that, and I'll just keep an eye on the chat. People have okay. Okay, thanks everyone. So our last section, we're just going to focus specifically on accessing support when working with young people. So it's going to be a combination. I've got a few resources which you may have opened already because I know you had these slides in advance. We're going to talk briefly about reporting systems and also just best practice when working with young people, with a focus kind of on like communication needs, amongst other things, which I can see from the things that people have shared in the chat. Again, lots of you are doing a great job already. We have a prompt question, but I am about 10 minutes behind. So we're going to go through this quite quickly because I don't want to keep anyone beyond the time today. But I just would like you to have a think briefly about, sorry, my laptop is being slow again, about the considerations that organisations need to think about when working with young adults. Now, obviously, we have spoken about quite a lot of this, so don't feel that you need to write this in the chat at this point. I think it's fine just to take a reflection point because we've spoken quite a lot about the considerations that we need to think about, but we're just going to go into some kind of specific best practice when it comes to working with and communicating with young adults. And I say young adults, but also young people. I can see from talking to everyone today that there's a mix of people here working with under 18s and also over 18s in that grey area age group that we've been talking about. And you're going to have an opportunity to go into breakout rooms and just, have a talk through some of the things that you are already doing, things that you're going to take away from today, some sort of practical steps, which hopefully will be a nice opportunity for you to talk to each other rather than just hear my voice for the whole time. Okay, so when it comes to communicating and working with young adults, I've touched on some of these things briefly. Some of these are new things. This is not an exhaustive list at all. This is probably, I would just say, like a condensed version of like the most important things that I've learned from my many years of like working with young people and young adults, but specific to the music industry. So just to start by touching on that point I made, particularly around our like current generation of young people, they want transparency. So I think issuing contracts is one of the first and most important thing that we need to consider when we are thinking about best practice when it comes to young adults, again, for all levels of work, whether it's a one night's work at an event, whether it's a 1 to 2 week contract or whether it's a longer kind of role that they're taking on with you. Set clear expectations. And I've suggested also, which I saw a couple of people are doing already, using verbal contracts for less formal subjects. So obviously when I'm talking about contracts in the first bullet points, I'm meaning specifically for the work that they're going to be completing for you. But I think norming on things like communication style and preference is really, really important. So where you are able to do that, which typically could be done, as part of an induction process or part of like an early check-in in, the first period of time at working, I think it's like super, super important. Just because sometimes, again, doing that proactively can stop a situation occurring that doesn't need to occur, that only really needs to be a conversation that takes place. So that's why I've used the term verbal contract. A strong and clear induction process is so important with early careers workers. I just think from my experience, I'm sure some people in this group will have had this experience, like where that isn't in place, it just results in them as like early career workers and young adults feeling kind of unsure. It affects their confidence. It sometimes can have a knock-on effect and can impact their ability to kind of ask questions. It can create a culture of them feeling like they should know this stuff anyway, but they don't. So, it can have lots of knock-on effects. So really, really strong and clear induction process is going to kind of knock a lot of those things on the head. Obviously, fostering a supportive environment and a culture within your organisation is super important for everyone within your organisation, but obviously, especially for the younger, earlier career workers, because, we've spoken about how it can be a daunting environment. I mean, any like early work is going to be daunting on a career journey, but yeah, the creative industries and the music industry can sometimes be a bit more daunting. I think as well, based on expectation, I think because so many people want to work in this industry, there is a big like expectation that they have, and also high expectations that young people will place on themselves in terms of making sure that they don't mess up their opportunities and so on. And so I think that the more you can foster a supportive environment and culture is going to, I guess, like ease some of those like nervous feelings that might exist in young people. Being as proactive as you can. We've spoken about proactivity in general, but I think like in terms of accessibility and requesting additional information. So for example, if there's somebody who has an access rider, has, you know, any reasonable adjustments that they needed, or just like any additional needs at all, I think sometimes it's better just to be proactive and like request and seek that information rather than wait for it. You know, when I think to some of the experiences I've had in my career, I've had a situation where I was placing some young people on work experience, and although I did like request some information, I think maybe I wasn't as explicit enough. And there was a situation where a young person who had, I would deem it as a medical need, but because nothing had been like diagnosed, they didn't feel that they needed to share it. And then it resulted in like a health situation occurring like on site on a work placement that was like very anxiety inducing for everyone. So I think now I always have that in my head as my example when I'm like, I need to really like request and push for as much additional information and have that kind of consultative approach where you're actually, you know, really talking to the new workers and so on. So you can make those adjustments if you can, and if you have the resource. I think designating a more experienced worker or somebody within your organization who's maybe a bit more experienced with working with that age group or is comfortable with that age group to be, I've used the term internal mentor. Doesn't necessarily have to be a mentor as such, but to go back to those points I made earlier about like checking opportunities and so on, just somebody who is more experienced, who have got the capacity to do that, I think is super helpful. Now, I do recognize, obviously, based on sometimes the size of organizations, that's not always possible. But like, I guess what I would say is if there's like a version of that you are able to resource, I think that is, incredibly beneficial to people in those like early stages. So yeah, thinking about what would work within your individual organizations. Fairness, transparency, clarity, and accessibility, I would say, are like four of like the most important keywords when thinking about like what I can see evidence of like what the generation that we're talking about in terms of age group kind of are looking for and want and really sort of value and like grateful for. So I think where we can kind of build those into like whatever we're creating, whether it be the role itself, whether it be the recruitment process, whether it be the induction process, whether it be the documentation that we are wanting them to familiarize themselves with, like whatever it might be, trying to always build those like keywords into those like parts of the role or the contract or whatever it might be, I think is super important. And then also, and this is something that I've been guilty of myself, you know, in my career in the past, is like assuming that someone might have knowledge that they need already. So, you know, somebody who's coming into a placement in a music organization, the assumption might be that they already know X, Y, and Z, that you just assume they would. And I think it's so important to actually remember that most of the time they probably won't. Again, it's something I'm experiencing at the moment. You know, I'm working with some young music producers who are part of an academy. And, you know, I often, even now, still find myself like assuming that because they are very passionate young people who want to go into the music industry and, you know about music production, that means they're going to know like who this person is, or they're going to have encountered this like thing that I think that they should have read. So I'm all the time reminding myself not to assume knowledge. And it's also so much better to, just like retell them, I suppose. Like it might seem like it's potentially repetitive, but I think, you know, it's all like bricks that are building their kind of like their knowledge, their industry readiness, their their feeling of comfort like in this work setting. So yeah, that's something that I have to remind myself all the time. In terms of reporting systems, which is really important when it comes to young people, is not just having reporting systems in place, but proactively supporting young adults in early career work to ensure that like rigorous reporting systems are in place in your organization and that everyone knows how the process works. And again, creating a culture where it's not like a fear-inducing thing, the thought of just making a report, because I think sometimes as well, the language of it, making a report, it sounds like it's always going to be something really serious, but sometimes it might just be about an issue that's occurring to do with the way that two people are working. But that early career person, well, I mean, everyone in an organization needs to be able to know how to report. But I think the difference when we're thinking about those young adults and those early career workers is chances are they're not going to have the confidence to do it. They're not certainly not going to have had the experience of where a situation has occurred that has maybe meant that they need to bring it up with someone. So I suppose that's the difference. Reporting systems are for everyone, but the reason why we should be probably more proactive with young people and young adults and early workers is just because they haven't got the same experience that we have. So making sure that you have those reporting systems in place, and again, probably build them into like an induction process is probably what I would recommend. But in terms of your reporting systems, you want to kind of aim for clear and aligned reporting systems across your organization, easily accessible. So both in terms of the content and the way it's written, but also like visibility within the organization. To go back to when I was talking about policies, if you have like a physical office space where you all work from, thinking about how that can be visible and how you can display that. Or if you're working kind of remotely, again, do you have an internal drive? Would it be on your website? Like what's the best way to make sure that it's really, really clear so that it's not just something that's mentioned at induction, and then actually when it comes to the time when a young person or a young adult or early career worker needs to use it, and then they can't really remember, or maybe they don't feel confident enough to ask someone, should be really kind of ingrained as part of your organization. Obviously, as with anything like this, regularly reviewed and updated. I mentioned already, but the best place I would probably recommend is to make sure that it's given to all workers during induction. And then also trying to build a culture of transparency when it comes to reporting. And again, to go back to what I said about the word report, just like the word safeguarding, it kind of feels that it's always going to be something that's like really maybe unpleasant and serious. But actually, sometimes it is just a bit of a conversation, and sometimes it can be a miscommunication that's taken place that just needs to be spoken about. It's not always going to be something that's like incredibly serious. So I think trying to have that culture of transparency so that everybody knows that you are an organization where if things come up and if issues arise, they can be spoken about and they can be reported. Because I think if you build that culture early, I think then hopefully there won't ever be like very serious things that occur that do need to be reported. But I think it just means that if something more serious does occur that needs reporting, if you've built that culture, it will be less daunting for somebody to report it, and also they are more likely to report it, which ultimately is what we want, because we want good practice that supports everyone. So yeah, and also as well, I'm going to at the end of the session just give you a few organizations that offer like external support, but I think also thinking about how you can build in support for those groups of people around like seeking external support. So for example, if you're an organization and you work with young adults who are like on placements or doing work in other organizations, let's say you're mentoring or career coaching or that type of thing, and you find out that they are doing what essentially sounds like an unpaid internship, just giving them that guidance about the fact that actually if what they are doing is classed as working, that they can, check the government guidance on that, and they can actually report to HMRC and like file for back pay if it's obvious that what they have been doing is just work labeled as like, a work placement or an internship, but just not being paid. So yeah, also kind of equipping yourself to feel confident where like maybe an external report also needs to be made, and yeah, supporting them through that is also really important. Okay, and so we're just going to have just about 10 minutes now in a breakout room to just kind of digest and think about what we've done over the course of today, but also specifically those slides around supporting and communicating with young people. So the first bullet point that I'd like you just to kind of consider and talk about in your groups is just around like what's something that was probably most useful to you in terms of what you will take away, like what you might be able to actually action based on something that we spoke about today. And then from that, like I'm sure you've already been thinking probably prior to this session, and hopefully like built on from this session, what are some actions that you plan to introduce to your organization? I've said 3, but we can be loose with that. Like, even if it's just like 1 or 2 that you are thinking about, like, what are those things? Sorry about the typo. I've just seen that it says organization. And then if you're comfortable to talk about it, like, what's an ongoing challenge that you face in your organization that, you know, you will continue to work on, that maybe is still kind of at the forefront of your mind based on what we've been talking about today. Obviously, the breakout rooms aren't recorded anyway, but when we come back into the session, if anyone wants to share like what they have talked about in their groups, that would be really welcomed, and that part won't be recorded. So yeah, don't worry if you have something you want to say that you don't want to be on YouTube. But as always, I won't make anyone like share anything if you don't want to, but hopefully you'll get some beneficial conversation with some of our peers in your groups. So organizations that offer support, in various kind of capacities that might be useful to some of your like young adults, young people. So there's Musicians Union, there's Help Musicians, and a branch of that is Music Minds Matter, which is like a mental health sort of branch of Help Musicians. Then there's Music Support, that is an organization that provides like free therapy and counselling for people who are working in the music industry. There's quite a strong focus on people who have been experiencing like addiction issues, but it is more broad than that as well. It can just be people who are looking and seeking some more general support. Then there's the Creative Industries Independent Standard Authority, which is CISA. That's kind of in the process of introducing and like cementing their report. But essentially, for those of you who haven't come across CISA yet, they are basically like a body that is going to be making sure that it's going to be easier for people to actually be able to make reports of malpractice within the creative industries. Sound Connections, NSPCC, obviously Youth Music, Music Guardians, which is my organisation. You can obviously reach out to any of those, and if that's relevant for various points of support in different areas. And then I just wanted to make a point of putting HMRC there. That's specifically for if you were, let's say, supporting a young person who you knew was experiencing like unpaid work when they were clearly working and it was being labelled as an internship. And as I mentioned at the beginning, when we circulate the recording, I'll make sure there's a link to that section on the government website where you can look at that, because it's detailed, and there's quite a lot of like specificities within there, but it is really useful actually. And that is something that I still see absolutely loads, and I'm sure you will also see that and experience that with your young people, either now or at some point, until we can completely eradicate it. But unfortunately, it is still a reality. So yeah, thank you. 12:31. Sorry, I've gone over by a minute. Obviously, I just want to give anyone an opportunity to ask any final questions. If you have any, I'll hang around for the next few minutes. I know you'll have to go, I'm sure, but if you do have any final questions, I'll just stay here for a bit if you feel like you want to ask anything. But just, yeah, thank you so much for joining. It's so encouraging and amazing to see when everyone signs up to these kind of sessions, because it just reminds us all that everyone is caring about the right things, and there are people in the industry who are prioritizing the safety and the rights of young adults. So thank you so much. It's been really nice to chat to you and meet you all, and yeah, I'm sure I'll see you again at a future training or whatever. And if you have any other questions that you want us to direct post session, you can always email the team at Youth Music, and then they can filter those through to me if you have any like later questions.